The night I stopped protecting my uncle, he promised it would only be for a few weeks, just until he got back on his feet. But 2 years later, I was the one covering the rent while he stayed home all day doing nothing. I watched strangers come and go from our living room. I found cigarette burns on my couch. I noticed food missing, money disappearing, and my things being sold behind my back. And every time I tried to set boundaries, he'd remind me that family takes care of each other. The night I finally changed the locks, I expected him to be angry. I didn't expect the phone calls from my family, calling me selfish, cold, heartless, saying I ruined his life, saying I tore our family apart. But none of them lived with the version of him I did. None of them know what it's like to lose yourself trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved. I keep telling myself I had no choice, but that's probably a lie. There's always a choice, isn't there? Even when it feels like the walls are closing in and every option seems wrong, there's still a choice. I just chose my sanity over my family's approval, and I'm not sure I'll ever stop paying for it. 2.5 years ago, I thought I was doing something good. My uncle had just gotten out of jail, his 4th time, but who's counting? And for once, he seemed different. Cleaner, focused. He'd been inside for 18 months on a possession charge, and when he called asking if he could stay with me and my sister until he got back on his feet, something in his voice made me believe this time would be different. My sister thought I was crazy. She'd been 12 when our uncle first went away, and she'd grown up watching him cycle through promises and failures like other people cycle through seasons. But I remembered him differently. Before the drugs, before the arrests, before everything went to hell, he'd been the fun uncle who taught me to drive stick shift in an empty parking lot when I was 15. He'd been the one who showed up to my high school graduation when my parents were too busy fighting to remember the date. So when he asked, I said yes. And when the landlord required all tenants to be on the lease and split the rent 3 ways, I convinced myself it was temporary. He just needed time to find a job, save some money, get his own place. I was 28, making decent money as a medical assistant, and my sister had just started college but was working part-time. We could handle it. The house was perfect for us, a 3-bedroom ranch in a quiet neighborhood where I could walk to work and my sister could catch the bus to campus. $800 each for rent, plus utilities split 3 ways. It felt manageable, even generous. I was helping family. I was doing the right thing. For the first year, I actually believed I'd made the right choice. He found work at a construction company, paid his share on time, kept his probation appointments. He'd cook dinner sometimes, these elaborate meals that reminded me of Sunday gatherings at my grandmother's house before she died. He'd watch movies with us on weekends, help my sister with her math homework, fix things around the house that I didn't know were broken. I started to relax. Started to think maybe people could change, maybe second chances, or 4th chances, sometimes worked out. I felt proud of myself for taking the risk, for believing in him when everyone else had given up. I felt like the good person in the family story, the one who never stops trying, never stops hoping. I should have known better. I should have remembered that hope, in my family, had always been a dangerous thing. The changes started so gradually I almost missed them. Or maybe I just didn't want to see them. His probation ended in September, and almost immediately, something shifted. Not dramatically, he didn't disappear for days or come home bloody and beaten like in the old days. It was subtler than that, which somehow made it worse. First, it was the friends. People I'd never seen before started showing up at the house. They'd sit on our front porch smoking cigarettes and talking too loudly, or they'd knock on the door at 10 o'clock at night, asking for it. When I asked about it, he'd wave me off with that familiar dismissive gesture I remembered from childhood. Just some friends from work, he'd say. Just guys he knew from the old neighborhood. Nothing to worry about. But I did worry. These weren't construction workers stopping by for a beer after their shift. These were hollow-eyed men and women who moved too quickly or too slowly, who couldn't quite focus on you when you spoke to them. I recognized the signs because I'd grown up around them. I knew what drug users looked like because my uncle had been one for most of my life. The money issues started in October. The first time he was late with rent, he had a reasonable explanation. Payroll had been delayed. The check would be in Monday. He'd give me cash to cover his portion as soon as he could get to the bank. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Wow. I paid his share along with mine and my sister's, $800 extra I really couldn't afford, but figured I'd get back in a few days. Monday came and went. Then Tuesday. When I asked about it Wednesday evening, He got defensive in a way that felt too familiar. Why was I hassling him? He'd said he'd take care of it. He always paid his bills, didn't he? The conversation ended with him storming out of the house and not coming back until after midnight, and I never saw that $800 again. November was worse. This time, he didn't even pretend he'd pay me back. He just said he'd work it out with the landlord directly and left it at that. When I tried to explain that wasn't how our arrangement worked, that we paid as a household, he accused me of trying to control him, of treating him like a child, of not respecting that he was a grown man who could handle his own affairs. I started doing the math in my head. $1,600 in 2 months. Money I didn't have. Money that was supposed to go toward my car payment and my student loans, and the tiny emergency fund I'd been trying to build since I turned 30. I was covering for him the same way I'd covered for him when I was 10 years old, lying to my parents about where their money had gone, making excuses for why he couldn't come to Christmas dinner or my birthday party. My sister started asking questions I couldn't answer. Why were there always strange cars in our driveway? Why did people keep calling the house phone at weird hours, hanging up when she answered? Why had I been so tense lately, jumping at every sound, checking the locks twice before bed? I didn't know how to tell her that I was starting to feel like a hostage in my own home. The night I found a stranger in our kitchen was the night everything changed. My sister and I had been at her boyfriend's place watching movies, and we came home around midnight to find every light in the house blazing and music playing loud enough that I was surprised the neighbors hadn't called to complain. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual because I'm obsessive about security. We walked into chaos. Empty beer bottles and full ashtrays covered every surface in the living room. Someone had spilled something dark and sticky on the carpet. The smell hit me immediately. Cigarettes, and sweat, and something chemical that made my eyes water. My sister grabbed my arm and I could feel her shaking. That's when we heard the noise from the kitchen. Not voices exactly, but shuffling and banging, like someone going through cabinets. I told my sister to wait by the door, to run if anything happened, and I walked toward the sound with my phone ready to call 911. The man standing in our kitchen wasn't someone I'd ever seen before. He was maybe 50, rail thin, with the kind of deep-set eyes that meant he hadn't slept in days. He was going through our refrigerator like he belonged there, eating leftover Chinese food with his hands. When he saw me, he just stared, a piece of lo mein hanging from his mouth. We stood there looking at each other for what felt like hours, was probably seconds. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. This wasn't my house anymore. It was a place where strangers could wander in and help themselves to whatever they wanted, while I paid the bills, and tried to pretend everything was normal. The man finally swallowed his food and nodded at me like we'd been introduced. He said my uncle was in his room, said they were just hanging out, said he'd been told he could get something to eat. His voice was slurred, but not drunk slurred. Drug slurred. I knew the difference. I told him he needed to leave. I said it quietly, because my sister was still standing by the front door, and I didn't want to escalate anything, but firmly enough that he understood I wasn't asking. He looked confused, like the idea of leaving hadn't occurred to him, but eventually he put down the container of food and shuffled toward the door. After he left, I stood in my kitchen looking at the mess, breathing in that chemical smell, and I realized I was crying. Not dramatic tears, just a slow leak that I couldn't seem to stop. My sister came over and hugged me, and for the first time since our uncle had moved in, I admitted to her that I thought we'd made a mistake. We cleaned up the house in silence, throwing away food that might have been tampered with, opening windows to air out rooms that reeked of substances I couldn't identify. I changed the locks the next morning. When my uncle came home that evening and couldn't get in, he called my phone screaming about how I'd locked him out of his own home, how I had no right, how he'd paid rent just like everyone else. I almost laughed. He hadn't paid rent in 3 months, but I let him in anyway, because what else was I going to do? Sleep on the couch with one eye open for the rest of my lease? That night, lying in bed, listening to voices and footsteps in the living room until dawn, I started planning my escape. Not from the house, I couldn't afford to break my lease, but from my uncle. From this situation. From the person I'd become while trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. December brought a new disaster I hadn't seen coming. I came home from work on a Thursday afternoon to find a woman I'd never met before sitting at our kitchen table, nodding off over a cup of coffee that had obviously gone cold hours ago. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 30s, with the kind of blonde hair that comes from a box and dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. My uncle introduced her as his girlfriend. Said she'd be staying with us for a while, just until she got back on her feet. Said it like it was already decided, like my sister and I had been consulted and agreed. Said it like our opinion didn't matter anyway. I should have put my foot down right then. I should have said absolutely not. This wasn't what we'd agreed to. She needed to find somewhere else to stay. But I was so tired of fighting, so exhausted from months of arguments about money and strangers and house rules that kept getting broken. I just stood there while she mumbled a hello and went back to whatever private conversation she was having with her coffee cup. Her name was something generic that I immediately forgot and had to keep asking my sister to remind me. She'd been living in hotels and motel rooms for months, bouncing between friends' couches and occasionally sleeping in her car. She had almost no belongings, just 2 garbage bags full of clothes and a purse she never let out of her sight. The first week, I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. She was quiet, kept to my uncle's room most of the time, helped with dishes occasionally. But it didn't take long to realize she was using heavily heroin, I suspected, based on the way she'd nod off mid-conversation and the track marks she tried to hide under long sleeves, even in the middle of winter. My sister started losing things. Small things at first, a sweater, some makeup, a pair of earrings. Then bigger things, her favorite jacket, the nice jeans she'd saved up to buy, a necklace our grandmother had given her before she died. When we confronted them about it, my uncle got defensive, and his girlfriend just shrugged and said she didn't know anything about missing clothes. Maybe we'd misplaced them. Maybe they were in the laundry. I started hiding my valuables in my bedroom, locking my door when I left for work. My sister did the same. We were living like prisoners in our own home, protecting ourselves from people we'd invited in. The fights started in January. Not between me and my uncle. We'd moved past fighting into something colder and more exhausting. The fights were between his girlfriend and my sister. These vicious screaming matches that would erupt over nothing. She'd accuse my sister of stealing her things, of looking at her wrong, of talking about her behind her back. My sister, who's never hurt anyone in her life, who still sends birthday cards to elementary school teachers she liked, would come to my room crying after these confrontations. I started spending more time at work, picking up extra shifts I didn't need because home had become unbearable. I'd arrive early and leave late, sometimes stopping at the library or a coffee shop just to avoid going back to our house. My sister started staying at her boyfriend's place more often, coming home only to get clothes or books for school. We were abandoning our own lives to avoid the chaos 2 people had brought into our space. And I was still paying most of the rent. February finally broke me. I'd been carrying the financial weight of our household for 4 months, watching my savings disappear and my credit card balances climb, while my uncle and his girlfriend treated our home like a flophouse. When rent was due on the 1st and I realized I'd have to cover his portion again, something inside me just snapped. I called our landlord and asked if I could meet with him to discuss the situation. I'd been dreading this conversation for months, partly because I was embarrassed about having to admit my family problems to someone who was essentially a stranger, and partly because I was afraid of what might happen if my uncle found out I'd gone behind his back. Our landlord was a decent man in his 60s who owned 3 rental properties and had been in the business long enough to have seen everything. When I showed up at his office that Tuesday morning, he already looked like he knew why I was there. I started by paying my sister's and my portion of the rent, apologizing for being a day late, explaining that I'd had to wait for my paycheck to clear. Then I took a deep breath and admitted what I should have said months earlier. My uncle hadn't been paying his share. The landlord wasn't surprised. He'd suspected as much, he said, but hadn't wanted to put me in the middle of family drama. He'd been hoping my uncle would work it out on his own, that it was just a temporary rough patch. But now, 4 months behind on rent, he couldn't ignore it anymore. I found myself telling him everything. About the strangers in our house, about the drugs, about my sister losing her things and both of us feeling unsafe in our own home. About how I'd been covering my uncle's expenses while he spent his money on whatever he was spending it on. About how guilty I felt for wanting him gone when I was the one who'd invited him in. The landlord listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or taking notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. He said he should have started the eviction process months ago, that he'd made a mistake trying to be understanding about the situation. He said he appreciated that I'd been covering the shortfall, but that it wasn't my responsibility to enable someone who was taking advantage of my generosity. He said he was going to serve my uncle with an eviction notice, and that I shouldn't feel guilty about it. I cried in his office. Not because I was sad about my uncle getting evicted, but because someone had finally told me it wasn't my fault. That I hadn't caused this situation by setting boundaries or expecting people to honor their commitments. That protecting myself and my sister wasn't selfish or cruel. He handed me a box of tissues and said something I'll never forget. You can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. And you shouldn't have to sacrifice your own stability trying. I drove home that day feeling lighter than I had in months, but also terrified about what would happen when my uncle found out what I'd done. The eviction notice was served on a Friday afternoon. I wasn't home when it happened. I'd been working late on purpose, not wanting to be there when the process server showed up. My sister texted me from campus to let me know someone had come to the door with legal papers, and that my uncle and his girlfriend had spent the last hour screaming at each other in his room. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes before driving home, trying to prepare myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. I'd been dreading this moment and anticipating it in equal measure for days. Part of me felt guilty about going behind his back, about not giving him one more chance to make things right. The larger part of me felt relief so overwhelming, it was almost physical. When I walked through the front door, my uncle was waiting for me in the living room with the notice in his hand. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, but also angrier. The kind of anger that comes from being caught doing something you know is wrong, but refusing to admit it. He wanted to know if I'd talked to the landlord, if I'd told him about the rent situation, if I'd orchestrated this whole thing to get him kicked out. His voice was loud enough that I worried about the neighbors hearing, but controlled enough that I knew he wasn't high. This was sober anger, which somehow felt worse. I told him yes, I'd talked to the landlord. I told him I'd been covering his rent for 4 months and I couldn't do it anymore. I told him about the strangers in our house, about my sister's missing belongings, about how neither of us felt safe anymore. I tried to keep my voice calm and factual, but my hands were shaking and I could hear the tremor in my words. He accused me of betraying him, of lying to him for months instead of being honest about how I felt, of destroying his life just when he was starting to get back on his feet. He said I was just like everyone else in our family, quick to judge, quick to give up, never willing to stand by someone when things got tough. That last part hit me harder than I expected because it felt partially true. I had given up on him. I had stopped believing he could change. I had chosen my own peace over his potential redemption, and I wasn't sure I'd ever stop feeling guilty about that. His girlfriend appeared in the doorway during our argument, swaying slightly and trying to focus on our faces. She said something about how they'd find somewhere else to go, how they didn't need us anyway, how we were all a bunch of uptight bitches who wouldn't know fun if it hit us in the face. My uncle told her to shut up, and she laughed like he'd made a joke. The whole scene was so pathetic and predictable that I almost started crying again. This wasn't how I'd wanted things to end. I'd wanted him to get clean, get stable, become the person I remembered from my childhood. I'd wanted to be a family member who never gave up, who always believed in second chances. Instead, I was the one calling the landlord and serving eviction notices and choosing my own survival over his. After they went back to his room, I called my sister and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long moment before she said she was proud of me, that she knew how hard it must have been, that she was ready for things to go back to normal, whatever that meant anymore. That night I lay in bed listening to them pack their things into garbage bags and cardboard boxes, whispering to each other in the hallway. I felt like a stranger in my own life, like I was watching someone else's crisis unfold from behind glass. They were gone by Sunday afternoon. My uncle left without saying goodbye, which hurt more than I expected. His girlfriend waved at me through the window of whatever car had come to pick them up, a gesture that felt more like mockery than farewell. The house felt enormous and impossibly quiet after they left. My sister and I walked through the rooms like tourists, touching surfaces and opening cabinets, as if we were seeing everything for the first time. His room smelled like cigarettes and something sweet and chemical. There were burn marks on the dresser, stains on the carpet that looked like they'd never come out. We spent the weekend cleaning, opening every window, and running fans in every room. My sister found some of her missing clothes stuffed in a garbage bag he'd left behind, but most of her things were gone for good. She didn't seem upset about it. If anything, she seemed relieved to have confirmation that she hadn't been imagining things. The first few nights alone in the house were strange. I kept waking up at sounds that turned out to be nothing. The refrigerator cycling on, the house settling, whined in the trees outside. My body had been so conditioned to expect chaos that the absence of it felt unnatural. Work became easier without the stress of coming home to crisis every day. My sister's grades improved immediately. We started cooking dinner together again, watching movies without worrying about who might interrupt or what kind of mood we'd find when we walked through the door. But The relief was complicated by a guilt I hadn't anticipated. I'd see homeless people on the street and wonder if one of them might be my uncle. I'd hear news stories about drug overdoses and feel a spike of panic. I'd written him off as a lost cause, but what if this was the thing that finally pushed him over the edge? My family had opinions, of course. Some relatives thought I'd done the right thing, that I'd been enabling him, and that tough love was the only way he'd learn. Others thought I'd been cruel and selfish, that family was supposed to stick together no matter what. My parents, predictably, managed to stay out of it entirely while making sure I knew they disapproved of my handling of the situation. I stopped trying to justify my decision to other people. I'd learned something during those months that I couldn't unlearn. That you can love someone and still refuse to let them destroy your life. That helping someone doesn't mean sacrificing your own well-being. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling destructive behavior, even if it means being seen as the bad guy. It's been 3 months since the eviction, and I'm still learning how to live with the choices I made. Some days I feel completely at peace with it. I protected my sister and myself from a situation that was rapidly becoming dangerous. Other days I feel like I failed in some fundamental way, like I should have tried harder to find a solution that didn't involve throwing family out on the street. I've heard from my uncle twice since he left. Once through a mutual relative who said he was staying with friends and doing okay. Once through a Facebook message at 2 in the morning where he called me a selfish bitch and said he hoped I was happy with myself. I deleted the message without responding, but it kept me awake for hours. My sister and I are still living in the house, just the two of us now. We're splitting the rent between us, which is more than I'd like to pay but manageable with careful budgeting. The landlord offered to let us find a third roommate, but neither of us is ready for that yet. We're still learning how to trust our own space again. I've started seeing a therapist, partly to deal with the family drama, but mostly to figure out why I have such a hard time setting boundaries with people I love. She says I'm not responsible for fixing other people's problems, which sounds obvious when she says it, but feels revolutionary when I try to apply it to my actual life. My uncle is still using, as far as I know. Still moving from place to place, still burning bridges with anyone who tries to help him. I've stopped following his trajectory through family gossip because it doesn't serve any purpose except to make me feel guilty about choices I can't undo. The hardest part isn't the judgment from other people, or the financial strain, or even the worry about what might happen to him. The hardest part is accepting that I did the right thing even though it feels wrong. That protecting yourself sometimes means disappointing the people you love. That you can't save someone by drowning yourself. I think about the version of me from 2.5 years ago, the one who thought love and good intentions were enough to fix anything. That version of me would be horrified by what I became. Someone who calls landlords and serves eviction notices and chooses her own peace over family loyalty. But that version of me had never lived with active addiction, had never watched someone she loved choose drugs over their own family, had never felt unsafe in her own home. I don't regret letting my uncle move in with us. He needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. I don't even regret how long I enabled the situation, hoping things would improve. Hope isn't a bad thing, even when it's misplaced. What I've learned is that hope without boundaries becomes enablement, and enablement helps no one. The house is quiet now in a way that feels peaceful rather than empty. My sister and I talk more, laugh more, sleep better. We're planning to adopt a cat when the lease is up for renewal. Small signs of a life returning to normal. Sometimes I still wonder what would have happened if I'd handled things differently. I'd set firmer boundaries earlier, if I'd been more direct about my concerns, if I'd refused to cover his rent from the beginning. But those are questions I'll never have answers to. And I'm learning to be okay with that uncertainty. I did what I thought was right with the information I had at the time. I protected the people I could protect, my sister and myself. I stopped enabling behavior that was destroying all of us. I chose my own well-being over someone else's dysfunction. And while that feels selfish, I'm starting to understand that it was necessary. My uncle made his choices every day for months. He chose drugs over stability, strangers over family, chaos over peace. I made one choice, to stop enabling those choices. I'm not the bad guy in this story, even though some days it feels like I am. The guilt may never completely go away, and maybe that's okay. It means I still care, still wish things had turned out differently. But I can carry that guilt without letting it destroy the life I've built, without using it as a reason to make the same mistakes again. I'm learning to live with the weight of my choices rather than the weight of other people's problems. It's a different kind of heavy, but it's one I can carry.